I'm struck as we near the end of this unit just how focused it's been on painting. Rodin's George Washington is our only other sculpture besides Rodin's Burghers of Calais, which I'm about to talk about. It's actually a little hard to know where to place Rodin in this course, especially now that we've moved Impressionism to our next Western art unit. In this statue, which is not a required work, but a good introduction to Rodin, you can see both the realist and the impressionist influence in Rodin's work. He strove to capture musculature and movement realistically. He too was interested in the photographs of Muybridge, for example. Yet his sculptures reveal a fascination with the play of light on surfaces, which would be an impressionist specialty. Art historians sometimes describe Rodin as the most important sculptor since Michelangelo. Bernini would probably take issue. But certainly Rodin was heavily influenced by Michelangelo's work, especially the unfinished slave statues that you see here. Rodin was especially impressed by the way the slaves seemed both to be imprisoned in and struggling to break free from the stone. Many of Rodin's sculptures also captured this quite deliberate, unfinished appearance. So here's one of Rodin's most famous and at the time most controversial sculptures, although not a required work. I'm showing the versions in both marble and cast bronze to give you a sense of how those two different media work out. The Kiss was part of Rodin's huge Gates of Hell project, which you read about, though only briefly, in your homework. The influence, again, of Michelangelo is clear here, as is Rodin's fascination with the erotic. And okay, I have to include Rodin's most famous sculpture. Rodin reproduced the Thinker in many sizes and media, but I've included the rendition that appears in the Gates of Hell so you can see it in context. The Thinker may have been Dante himself, but why would he be naked? It's something art historians are still arguing about. Here again, though, you see Rodin's debt to Hellenistic and to Renaissance sculpture, but also his unique expressive style. You saw this sculpture in the Khan Academy essay. It's one of my favorites, and Rodin considered it to be his very best work. While Rodin never entirely abandoned realism, here he displays his expressionist style. Stay tuned. The rough-cut features and the monumental size are intended to capture the energy and force of the subject in a way that a purely realistic and proportional sculpture could not. The robe disguises as much as it reveals Balzac's body, and it draws attention toward that oversized head. Rodin knew that the head was out of proportion. It's really a symbol of Balzac's genius and a movement, again, away from non-representational art. The 20th century is almost here in this course. Finally, our required work. And yes, for once again, I am very happy with the College Board's choice. I love this sculpture, in part because it has such a great story. Here's the story. Edward's king, Edward III, after a victory in the Battle of Crécy during the 100 Years' War, laid siege to Calais, where Philip VI of France ordered the city to hold out at all costs. Philip failed to lift the siege, and eventually starvation forced the city to parley for surrender. Edward offered to spare the people of the city if any 6 of its top leaders would surrender themselves to him, presumably to be executed. Edward demanded that they walk out wearing nooses around their necks and carrying the keys to the city and the castle. One of the wealthiest of the town leaders, Eustache de Saint-Pierre, volunteered first, and 5 other burghers joined him. Although the burghers expected, according to this version, to be executed, their lives were spared by the intervention of Edward's wife, Queen Philippa, who persuaded her husband to exercise mercy by claiming that their deaths would be a bad omen for her unborn child. Here's another view from a different casting and location. Note that the sculpture is intended to be seen from all sides. It's intended to be walked around and really kind of participated in. So as he prepared to fulfill his commission, Rodin studied the major historical source on the subject, which is a 14th century history written by Jean Froissart. Here are a couple of illustrations from earlier illuminated manuscripts. And here is Froissart's account. I'm including it because you'll see how it influenced Rodin's artistic choices. Quote, "The richest burgher in the town, Sir Eustache de Saint-Pierre, got up and said, 'Gentlemen, it would be a great shame to allow so many people to starve to death, if there were any way of preventing it, and it would be highly pleasing to our Lord if anyone could save them from such a fate. I have such faith and trust in gaining pardon and grace from our Lord, if I die in the attempt, that I will put myself forward as the first. I will willingly go out in my shirt, bareheaded and barefoot with a halter around my neck, that is a noose, and put myself at the mercy of the King of England. The chronicle continues, another very rich and much respected citizen called Jean d'Air rose up and said he would keep him company. The third to volunteer was Sir Jacques de Wesson, who was very rich both by inheritance and by his own transactions. He offered to accompany his two cousins, and so did Sir Pierre, his brother. Two others completed the number and set off dressed only in their shirts and breeches with halters around their neck, as they had been told. I hate to spoil this splendid story, but not all historians think Froissart's account is entirely accurate. Here's an alternative view from a historian of the 100 Years' War. There was indeed a ritual of submission by the people of Calais, but it was mainly organized in advance, not spontaneously. The people of Calais had negotiated a pardon, and it was only once they were virtually certain of this pardon that they agreed to perform the rite. The burghers did indeed wear halters, that is, nooses around their neck, but they were accompanied by the town's men-at-arms. The historian notes that our hero, Eustache de Saint-Pierre, actually received a reward from the King of England. Well, from our standpoint, this may not make much difference. Neither Rodin nor the town fathers of Calais took this historian's view. They bought into Froissart's account entirely. Which is not to say that the town fathers of Calais were happy with the statue they received. Rodin broke with tradition by placing his cast bronze sculpture on a low pedestal to bring the burghers face to face with the people of Calais. Rodin's explanation for this was that he wanted the viewer to, quote, penetrate to the heart of the subject, unquote. At ground level, the figure's positions lead the viewer around the work. His patrons disagreed. And in fairness, they may have had some reason to complain. The sketches and preliminary plaster mode or maquette that Rodin submitted to win the commission looked quite different from his final product. Note that the model shows 6 figures striding forward with the figure of Eustache de Saint-Pierre leading the group. It also shows the figures up on a pedestal. But Rodin kept thinking about this work and reworking it. And here is the second maquette, which is much closer to the work as finally cast. And this is the Calais Committee's initial response. I quote, "This is not the way we envisaged our glorious citizens going to the camp of the King of England. Their defeated postures offend our religion. The silhouette of the group leaves much to be desired from the point of view of elegance. The artist could give more movement to the ground, which supports his figures and could even break the monotony and dryness of the silhouette by varying the heights of the 6 subjects. We feel it our duty to insist that Monsieur Rodin modify the attitudes of his figures and the silhouette of his group." Basically, the committee was saying that the sculpture broke with the traditions that had been laid down by the French École des Beaux-Arts, including, when possible, the adoption of a pyramidal structure that emphasized the most important figure or figures. And Rodin replied, yes, his sculpture did depart from these conventions, and good thing too. So here's part of his reply, quote, "I am the antagonist in Paris of that affected academic style. You are asking me to follow the people whose conventional art I despise." Didn't mince his words, did he? The committee eventually relented and Rodin proceeded with the work. It was displayed as he intended on the ground at an exhibition in Paris. The town fathers of Calais, meanwhile, placed their cast of the burghers on a high pedestal and banished it to a remote corner of the city. In 1926, the city of Calais reinstalled the sculpture on a low pedestal and moved it to a place of prominence in front of the town hall, where it stands today. By the way, if you're wondering why this setting looks different from the required image that we started with, it is. French law permitted 12 lost wax method bronzes to be cast from Rodin's original plaster model. The first one you saw was cast for the gardens outside the palaces of Westminster. Remember those? And it's an interesting and moving choice, since an English king both endangered and pardoned the burghers. This one's the version in Calais outside the town hall. So here's a question that requires us to jump ahead where we are in art history. So let me pose it especially to those of you who've taken more history and know what happens next. What changed in France between 1895 and 1926 that might have changed the minds of the city fathers of Calais? Well, in 1895, France was recovering from its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. It was growing economically. It had become a major imperial power, eager to assert leadership in Europe and the world. So the town fathers of Calais were looking for an image of victorious self-sacrifice, not of defeat. Intriguingly, maybe ironically, in 1926, France had won a war with Germany, but at a terrible human cost. Europeans and the French were feeling much less triumphant about war and much more inclined to see sacrifice in terms of its human cost. We will return to that story. But meanwhile, here's an example of a late 19th century history painting celebrating the French invading Lebanon, allegedly to defend Lebanese Christians. And here are some battle scenes of French soldiers from World War I. The artist is actually Belgian, but you get the idea. So what's changed? Well, this war is more terrible, but notice it's also more individual. And of course, by then, Rodin was even more famous, and politicians were less likely to second-guess his artistic choices. So what artistic choices did Rodin make? I've covered some of this. Well, note he decided to portray collective sacrifice. Memorial sculptures tended to focus on one hero, or at least put one hero at the top of the pyramid. We saw that in the Romantic paintings as well. But Rodin rejected that tradition. This is more like the realist tradition of Courbet, the Stonebreakers. Yet, do they seem to be acting as a team moving forward? Well, even though they're a group and their fates are intertwined, we actually see them, I think, as radically isolated. A couple of other interesting points. I mentioned that Rodin was very interested in the photographs of Muybridge, and he felt that by showing different figures all moving in different ways, he could capture some of the same power of motion that Muybridge did in his photographs, but in a single sculpture. Also notice, and I actually probably should have put a slide above these, Rodin does hands wonderfully, but his hands are out of size. They're not in proportion, just like his heads are often not in proportion to the body. And Rodin himself explained that they were, as it were, weighted down by their decision, and that the large hands were part of that. Above all, Rodin is asking the viewers to join the burghers in their march toward death, to mingle among them, to acknowledge maybe their common humanity. We too are victims. We too are heroes. We too fear death. We too are willing to sacrifice for the greater good. I think it's much of what makes this sculpture so powerful. So think about what this work says about an artist's and a nation's attitude toward its own history. The subject, by the way, of this unit's major essay. Stay tuned.